If you came to my talk yesterday, I talked about A3s, and one of the ones I kind of briefly mentioned was one called the X matrix. I'm going to spend a lot more time on that today, but within the context of something called strategy deployment. So when I started using the X matrix and started getting into strategy deployment, I suddenly realised that for me it was kind of one of those eye-opening moments when it was a missing piece of the puzzle for me, particularly when we're working with large enterprises and we're trying to help large organisations to become more agile. Normally we go in and let's just work with some teams and let's go and work with the IT department. And you hit a glass ceiling, you hit a point at which maybe you start losing effectiveness. And what we're really wanting to do is use Agile as a strategy to help the whole organisation improve. So I'm going to talk around some ideas around that. First, a little quote from this, everybody know this well-known Agile consultant? Dean Karnazes? Nobody? Nobody heard of him? Okay, I've got one hand going up. He's not an Agile consultant, really. So this guy's an ultra-marathon runner. So he runs like 100 miles at a time. So I'm into running, so I kind of read a lot of running blogs and running magazines. And there's an article I'd read recently that this quote was in. And I just thought, you know what, that's quite applicable to the sort of stuff I do when I'm consulting with organisations. So I always encourage people to try new things and experiment to find out what works for them. For me, that's what strategy deployment is about. We're going in and we're trying to help organisations find new ways of working. It's like a new business model, new way of running your organisation, where instead of just coming in and saying, right, this is the way we're going to operate, and we're going to copy some other successful organisation, it's about saying, you know what, we know what we want to achieve, we know where we want to go and where we want to be, but we don't really know how we're going to get there. So we'll set ourselves a strategy, and then we'll experiment, and we'll evolve, and we'll figure out what the right way of working for us is. So constantly experimenting as an organisation to find out what your best way of working for you is. So surely everybody knows this. Okay, I'm going to ask you now, after count of 3, I want everybody to do the Mobot. Alright, this is your post-lunch bit of exercise. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Come on, you know the Mobot? Somebody's looking confused there. Alright, so Mo Farah, one of the best runners certainly at the moment, if not ever. You know, there's a big debate back in the UK, is he our best ever UK athlete? I do a lot of 5k and 10k running. I would love to be as good a runner as Mo Farah is. Maybe what I could do to be that good would be to look at one of his training sessions and just copy it. If I just do the same training as Mo does, surely I will be as good as runner. So I would start off by doing a mile in about just under 4 minutes, and then I'd do a couple of laps recovery because that'd be quite tiring. Immediately followed by 1200 meters in just under 3 minutes with a bit of recovery. 1000 meters in 2:27, a couple of laps recovery. 800 meters in 1:57, 2 laps recovery. 600 meters in 80 seconds, a couple of laps recovery. 400 meters in 50 seconds, a couple of laps recovery, and then 200 meters in 25 seconds. If you're looking at doing the maths on that, you'll see that his pace is getting quicker. Each little bit of that training session over a shorter distance, he's getting quicker. Oh, and by the way, at altitude. So that's pretty much nearly mile high. Now if I tried to do that, it would probably kill me. Just for comparison, I did a 1 mile race recently and did it in about 6.5 minutes. So basically he runs twice as fast as me. So there's no way I could do that. Even if I tried to copy his training techniques, it wouldn't work for me, and probably I would just lose the love of running. Not worth even trying. So there's no point in looking at successful organisations and Spotify or Netflix or Apple or whoever the latest trendy organisation is to be doing new things and saying, oh, they're good at what they do, let's just copy them. I don't think it'll work because it's more than just the practices and the processes that you use. There's something about the DNA and the culture and all those sorts of things. So I like this phrase that came from the same running magazine. Don't be a tabby cat trying to emulate a cheetah. Mo Farah's a cheetah when it comes to running, and I'm a tabby cat. There's no point in me trying to copy him. Netflix or Spotify, they're cheaters when it comes to organisations. Your organisation just may not be able to be as successful as them, so don't try and copy them. Instead, try and be an ambidextrous methodologist. So people know what ambidextrous is? Where you're as good at doing something with your right hand is with your left hand. So if you can write well with your right hand and write well with your left hand, you're ambidextrous. So equally strong in both hands. You don't have a bias towards always using your right hand or a bias towards always using your left hand. So it's kind of left-handed, right-handed scissors here. So the idea of an ambidextrous methodologist is saying, you know what, let's pick a practice. Let's pick story pointing, because that's nice and controversial. On the one hand, story pointing could be good. Vasco's laughing. Story pointing could be good. Story pointing could be useful. On the other hand, it might have some risks, it might have some flaws. Now, if I'm not ambidextrous, I'm always going to go with story pointing good. Or I might go story pointing bad. But you know what? I want to weigh it up with both hands and decide, in my circumstances, in my context, what should I do? So don't be biased towards one way or the other. Try and be ambidextrous. Figure out what's going to work for yourselves, because what works for other people is all to do with their context, their environment. So as I said, strategy deployment is a way of doing that. It's a way of running experiments, trying to figure out what are the right processes, what are the right practices, what are the right techniques we should be using as an organization to improve. So like most really good ideas, it actually came from Japan and has the original name is Japanese. So the original name for it, and if you kind of start looking up on the internet, you'll see it refer to Hoshin Kanri. And I just think of it as this new business operating model. If businesses start applying this way of working, this way of running, then every organization can be a unique organization, be as successful as they can be. So the translation it doesn't really show up there, is it? So the literal translation at the bottom is direction management. So Hoshin means direction and Kanri is management. It's this idea of managing the direction of the organization so everybody works together. Or kind of artistic translation is the one at the top, ship in a storm going in the right direction. I like that one. So the idea is your organisation is in turbulent waters, there's lots of competition, the landscape's changing, technologies are changing, and you want to get the ship to safe waters. So you've got everybody pulling together, rowing together, sailing together in the same direction towards the closest port. I think that's a nice kind of rich way of thinking about what Hoshin Kanris are about. So instead of just the old command and control way of doing it, if somebody's saying do this, so we're kind of moving from this idea of I have a plan, I know what the right way of working is, just do it, don't think about it, I don't pay you to think, and don't ask any questions, just do what I say. Have anybody worked in an organisation like that? No, never. So this way of working is like, well, I've got an idea, I've got something we could try. Here, have a look at this idea. Tell me what you think about it. Give me some feedback on it. What questions do you have about it? What's not clear? And then we can work together on improving the idea and coming up with an even better idea that we can work. So it's a much more collaborative way of working. Instead of this kind of top-down way of working, it's collaborating, co-creating, and everybody understanding what they're doing, why they're doing it. It's about getting the people at the front line, the people who do the work, who understand how best to do the work and how you might be able to improve doing the work, to come up with ideas and be involved in improving the way we work, but in a way that's aligned, in a way that points us in the same direction. We're not saying just everybody do your own thing, come up with your own ideas, because the risk with that is somebody kind of thinks we're going in that direction, somebody thinks we're going in that direction, and then people are pulling against each other. So we're trying to get everybody pointing in the same direction, everybody working to the same vision, the same goals, asking questions, coming up with ideas, and figuring things out for themselves. So strategy then is like an enabling constraint. So this is a metaphor from Dave Snowden, and he talks about enabling constraints and governing constraints, and then the metaphor of the skeleton. So the exoskeleton is the external skeleton. It's the shell. It's very constraining. It's there to protect you and stop bad things happening, and it stops you growing, stops you being creative. That's a governing constraint. So it basically tells you what not to do, a governing constraint. But the exoskeleton, that's the skeleton inside us, endoskeleton. Yeah, this endoskeleton, the skeleton that's inside us, that's what we have as human people. That's an enabling constraint. So that's a constraint that allows us to come up with new things and guides us through what could be, but it holds things together. So strategy is an enabling constraint which keep things cohesive, keeps things aligned, keeps things together, but which allows us the freedom to grow and the freedom to try new things and the freedom to evolve. So yeah, this is a picture of a starfish that's got the internal skeleton. That's an enabling constraint. That's how we want to use strategy. So I really like this quote while we're kind of looking at defining what we mean by strategy from Stephen Parry. We want our organisations to understand what the purpose is. So usually the founders of the organisation have a really purpose and a passion about what they're about, why they created the organisation, and they have a vision for what the future would like to look like. Their strategy is how they're going to get there. Now we want that to be an enabling constraint so that we might actually get there. The things we do on the way, we want to be creative about, but the strategy says this is how we're going to get there, and then the tactics are the things we actually do. So that's how we survive the journey. So we're making a differentiation here between strategy and tactics. We want a single strategy that everybody's aligned to, but we want to give people the freedom to come up with their own tactics and figure out how we survive the journey. So, agility is a strategy. Agile is a tactic. I think when the guys that got together in Snowbird and were coming up with the Agile Manifesto, what they were trying to describe was some strategic choices they were made from. If you kind of squint at the manifesto and the 4 value statements, I think what they're the first 4 value statements are strategic statements, really. And then the things we actually do, all the great stuff that the Agile communities come up with, the processes, the practice, the techniques, the technologies, they're tactical things. Scrum is a tactic. Kanban is a tactic. Now if we go in and we just say, right, do Scrum, do Kanban, do TDD, we're just telling people what to do, and that's not necessarily going to be aligned. So what we want to do with strategy deployment, and particularly in the context of an Agile transformation, is understand what our organisational strategies are and how Agile can help that as a strategy. And I don't think you would go in and say, oh, our strategy is to be Agile. You'd probably go down and be a little bit more descriptive than that. But effectively, that's what we're saying. Agile is a strategy. And then we can understand how are the tactical things that we're doing with our Agile teams, our Agile practices, our Agile technologies. How does that help us meet and become more Agile as a strategy? And how does agility as a strategy help our organizations become more successful? So the X matrix is a really nice way of doing that. So it's an A3. So I talked about A3s yesterday. The A3 is a 11 by 7 inch piece of paper. So effectively you're describing your strategy and the way you're deploying your strategy on a single piece of paper. So it helps you visualize what's going on, which means we can have conversations about it. It's really simple to update. It's really simple to evolve. So there's basically 4 bits to it. This is a really simplified version of it. We start off by defining the results that we want to get. Why do we want to be Agile? Why do we want to do Agile? What's it all about? It's because we want to achieve some certain results. We think that if we can achieve some results, our organisation will be successful. In order to achieve those results, we need a strategy. So what are our strategies to achieve those results? And then on this side, what are the indicators that are going to tell us whether the strategy is working? So KPIs, Beati talked about KPIs in his keynote yesterday, things like that. These are the leading indicators versus the results, which are the kind of the primary trailing indicator. Have we been successful? The indicators tell us, are we likely to be successful? And then the tactics at the top, what are we actually doing in order to implement the strategy and to move the needle on the indicators in order to achieve those results? And then you've got these 4 corners which show how all those things correlate to each other. So we can see the 4 primary elements of our strategy and how we're implementing that strategy, and then we can see how it all ties together, and then we can have conversations about, does it tie together? Are we doing something which doesn't tie to our strategy? Are we doing something that we can't measure? Do we actually know what results we're trying to achieve? Getting all that down on a single piece of paper is really good. So this nicely maps onto Simon Sinek. Hands up if you've read Simon Sinek's book. Really good book. So he talks about starting with why, and he has what he calls a golden circle. The why is our passion and our purpose and the results we want to achieve. The results are kind of the measurable indication of what we're trying to achieve. So starting with why is start with your results. Start with understanding the results and what you want to achieve. Then you move on to how. How are we going to achieve those results? That's your strategy. And then what are we going to do to achieve those results? Those are your tactics. Now the thing that he misses out is whether it all lines up. Those are your indicators. So that's me just kind of giving Simon a little bit of extra stuff for his next book. Also, you've got these sets of definitions from Mikhail Belikov. So again, the 4 elements in there, which I think is nice mapping onto the X matrix. The goal is the broad primary outcome. What is it? What's the main thing we need to achieve? Those are our results that we want to achieve. Strategies, how are we going to achieve that? What's our approach to meeting those goals and meeting those objectives and getting those results? And then he calls an objective the measurable step you take to achieve the strategy. So the objectives, that's what I call indicators. That's the measurable piece that's the key there. And then tactics are the tools that we're going to use in pursuing an objective associated with the strategy. What are we going to do? So those are those 4 pieces. Let's talk them a little bit more. So when you're filling one of these in, you're going to start off with looking at what results you want to achieve. And why do we need to improve our competitive capabilities? Strategy deployment is really all about improving organizational capability. If the organizational capability improves, organization is more successful, we can either stay ahead of our competition or maybe we need to catch the competition up. But it's all about improvement. So what do we need to improve? Why do we need to improve? And how are we going to measure that? So Don Reinertsen talks about economic models. Recommend reading Don Reinertsen's work. Generally, if you've got an economic model that you can use to describe your results, those things you can start putting into results for your primary goal. So generally this is financial, this is value based, and we can look at that from 2 levels. So this is based on stuff that I think I picked it up from Chris Matt's. 4 types of value. You're either trying to increase your revenue or maintain your existing revenue, or you're trying to decrease cost, or you're trying to avoid cost. Most organizations financial, so you can apply this straight away. I think it still works if you're in a not-for-profit or a non-financial, mainly because even not-for-profit organizations run off money, so you still need to get revenue, you're just not trying to make a profit, and you still have operating costs. So increasing revenue, you could look at how do we want to increase our sales? Do we want to get a certain number of unit sales or increase our sales by a certain percentage? Or maybe we could measure it in increasing or attaining a certain number of customers, or maybe it's more transaction based. And transaction based then could be, if you're in a hospital, number of operations we're doing, number of lives saved, things like that. So you can put some numbers on those and you can say by the end of the year we would like to have this number of sales or this number of customers or this number of transactions, and that's a measure of success. Equally then on the cost we could look at, well, we can measure our development costs, or maybe there's some other kind of administrative costs we can measure. We want to be managing those because there's no point in increasing the revenue coming in if cost increases more. So we do need to be looking at cost. Or maybe we could look at the cost of failure. So do we measure the number of warranty claims we get, things like that. If we can reduce the number of warranty claims, reduce the cost, we make more overall profit. So we can start identifying a small number of key things that we could, at the end of the year, we can say if we achieve those results, that's probably going to be a good thing. We can call that success. So how do we do that? We need to improve in order to achieve those results. So how can we improve our competitive capabilities? And here we're talking about significant breakthroughs. What are the big things we need to do? So there's the big thing about, hope is not a strategy. So you're probably not going to write, let's hope we achieve the results there. We need to do something specific, and we need to do something different. So doing the same thing probably isn't going to be a strategy. Doing nothing isn't going to be a strategy. You want to do something different. These are kind of big breakthrough things that we could do. So generally, I think about these things from an agile perspective about, well, do we need to improve the flow of the work in any way? Improve, and that's a kind of a process way of thinking about it. We can improve the flow of the work, or we could just look at what is the value that we're delivering. Is there something we need to do to deliver more value, which might be improving the product, it might be changing the product, it might be improving the quality of the product. And then maybe there's something about improving the potential, so a more forward-thinking strategy. So potential is, the ability to succeed in the future. If we have high potential, we're more likely to be a longer living company. And we can then drive that down. So flow, if we have good flow, maybe we can say, hey, we need to be more predictability, and therefore by improving flow, improving our processes, we could be more predictable. Or we need to be more productive. We need to be delivering more work, more products, more releases, and that might be a flow-related thing. we could measure value or we could talk about our strategy around value being about we should be focusing on our customer. Let's have a strategy around customer satisfaction, or a strategy around we need to be improving our quality, or employee satisfaction and responsiveness. So these are probably more things that you would particularly talk about with your leadership teams, senior management. If you're just going to senior management, say, "Oh, I've got this great idea. We should have a strategy around agile." That probably kind of throw you out of the room. But if you start talking about strategy around, you know what, I think if we're more predictable, or I think if we were more productive and we could create a strategy around that, that's probably a conversation that's worth having, and you probably have a really good constructive conversation around those. So just some ideas around the sorts of things that I look for, I talk about when I'm looking at organisation strategies. But actually, I would probably go to an organisation and say, what's your strategy? Because normally somebody in the organisation has a strategy, and then you can understand, and you might start using some of these ideas to understand their strategy. Generally, I think they're related, these things. So once we understand strategy, we can say, okay, well, what can we measure that would indicate whether the strategy is working? So how will we know whether the competitive capabilities are improving? And these things then are proxy variables. They're not the real variables that you're going to be using, but they're going to be things that will give us a leading indication. So we think that if this number is increasing in a good way, probably that's a good sign, and therefore it's probably going to give us a good feeling about whether we can achieve our results. So these numbers in themselves are not the be all and end all, and you could have indicators and meet all the indicators and not achieve the results, but they're probably things that you think we could measure that, and we could get some really quick feedback by watching these indicators as to whether we're going to get the results. So we have a whole load of things we could measure, and a lot of them are kind of well known to Agile. We could measure work in process. I'm just going to pull out some of the ones that I can read easily. Due date performance, that's a measure of predictability. Lead time, that's going to be a measure of our responsiveness. Net promoter score, that could be a good way of measuring our customer satisfaction, and whether we're delivering value. Features per release is probably a measure of productivity. Escape defects, that'd be a good measure of quality. There's loads of these. I just kind of went and brainstormed them into a big list and created a tag cloud from them. But again, what makes sense to you? Given your strategy, what would you want to measure that you think is going to tell you that your strategy is working? And we can be inspired by a lot of the agile metrics that we use out there to figure out which ones we should be using. And then lastly, we get to tactics. So the key thing for me is to do the tactics last. It's really easy for us, particularly for me as a consultant, is to go in and kind of go, I know what you should be doing. Here, just do this tactic, follow this practice. And we jump straight into the tactics. By starting with the results and then going through strategies and indicators, we kind of create a kind of a bit of a divergence, and then we can bring it all back together and converge again on, okay, what things could we do which we think are going to help us with the strategy, and we think will move the needle and move the indicators in the right direction. So these are investments we're making. They're kind of little mini projects that we think are things that we can do to improve competitive capabilities. And they're things like processes, practices, technologies, things that we can introduce, new ways of working, which we think are going to help us improve. So again, loads up there, loads of things, from this higher level of scaled agile frameworks. You've got SAFe up there, Less up there, Nexus, down to team level stuff, Scrum, Kanban, XP, down to really detailed practices, planning poker, daily stand-ups, story mapping. There's a whole load of things that we could do. Work out which ones do you think are going to be useful, but understand why they're going to be useful, because they should align to a strategy, and understand how you're going to know whether they're working, because they should map onto some indicator, and those things will then also align to your results. So that's the magic bit, is these corner pieces and the correlations. So how do we know, and how well will the elements correlate with each other? And we're looking for where there's really strong alignment, or we're looking for maybe whether there's no alignment. So where there's strong alignment, you can say, here's a result we want to get. This strategy is going to really help us towards that result. And this indicator, this measure, is going to strongly tell us whether we're going to achieve the result. And there's this new practice that we can introduce, which really strongly aligns to the strategy and we think is going to really move the needle on the indicators. If you've got really strong alignment all the way round, that's probably a good thing. If you start coming up with strategies and you've got no tactics against them, no tactics aligned to that strategy, you want to be seeing that. Similarly, if you've got a tactic up there that somebody's doing and it's got no alignment to the strategy, should you be doing it? So coming up and filling in these, and again, this is a collaborative thing, exploring it together and having these conversations gives you a way of figuring out, what are we doing the right thing, why are we doing things, and does everybody understand that? So I came up with a sample X matrix, and I think we're doing well for time. So I'm going to give you a few minutes. Just turn to somebody, the people next to you in kind of groups of 2 and 3. Have a look at that, look at the results, look at the strategies, look at the indicators, look at the tactics, look at the correlations. So these big ones that are filled in here, this is indicating a really strong correlation. So what I'm saying here is that I believe that if we have a decrease in the number of support cases, that will decrease that will lead to a reduction in customer churn, and that's a result. So as a result, at the end of the year, I want to reduce customer churn, and I believe that decreasing the support cases strongly aligns to that. Whereas this one here, the one with kind of it's not filled in, that's a kind of weak correlation. There's something there, but it's not really strong. So I think that if we increase the percent, so increase percentage innovation, that's kind of the percentage of work that we're doing which is innovative, which is kind of pushing the boundaries. I think therefore you can increase that. I think that might help reduce churn, but it's not going to be a really strong correlation. But if we're doing innovative stuff, we think customers might say. So there's some kind of weak correlation there, but it's not really strong. Whereas this one here, where it's not filled in, there's no correlation here. So what I'm saying here is, I think if we increase our throughput, so if we deliver more stuff, I don't think that's going to have anything to do with reduced churn. No correlation at all there. So look around those and talk to the person next to you for a few minutes. What surprises you there? What doesn't make sense? What questions do you have about that? I threw that together really quickly. I'm pretty sure there are things in there that you will disagree with, or things that you're surprising, or things that don't make sense. So just spend a few minutes talking to the person next to you, looking at that. What questions do you have? What doesn't make sense? What looks surprising on there? And then we'll just kind of get people to shout out a few ideas. Has anybody read Jeff Patton's User Stories book? So he makes a really good analogy in there where he talks about holiday photos, and he talks about the holiday photo. When you look at a holiday photo, if you were there, that holiday photo has a whole load of meaning, because there's a lot of stuff that went on behind it. Whereas if you weren't on holiday, it's just a photo. So the photo behind this quote is actually my daughter. So I got my mandatory cat photo in earlier. Now I have my mandatory photo of my daughter in my presentation. Actually, it's probably a really bad photo because it's really blurred and out of focus. But I love that photo because I was there and this was our holiday this year. So it's the memories that make that photo good for me, not the kind of the artisticness behind it. And it's the same when we're filling in X matrices and we're going through this strategy deployment. It's the memory of what was said and felt that creates the alignment. It's not the piece of paper. So it's about having these conversations, asking these questions, answering these questions, and coming up with trade-offs and coming up with the understanding and having those conversations. And on a similar note, Durward Sobek. So Durward Sobek wrote the book on A3 thinking. If you're going to read up on A3 thinking, read Durward's book. And he has this really nice quote here that I won't read the whole of it, but the second sentence is the important sentence. It's the process of creating a report becomes the thing of value. It's not the piece of paper that's the value. It's the process that you go through to create the piece of paper. So again, the same thing. The X matrix is an A3, so the same thing applies. It's all about using that piece of paper and the framework to drive conversations, have conversations, and generate the meaning and the value from that. And that all comes about through what's called the catchball process. So the A3 is just a piece of paper on its own. It could be used for evil, like most things. You could imagine a senior manager filling an X matrix in and saying, "Go do this," Here's our strategy and your tactics, and here's how I'm going to measure whether you're going to be successful or not. We don't want to be doing that. We want to be playing catchball. So this is all about this idea of decentralizing decision making. The people at the top of the organization don't have all the answers. Probably the people across the organization, the people that are doing the real day-to-day work, have a lot of answers and a lot of good ideas. So catchball is decentralized decision making. So Beatty used the roundabout metaphor yesterday. This is my favorite roundabout. Anybody know where this roundabout is? Yeah, so this is the magic roundabout in Swindon. Dave Snowden uses it a lot. I've driven around it once. It's a roundabout surrounded by roundabouts. Looks really scary, doesn't it? Actually, it's one of the safest roundabouts, certainly in the country, if not Europe, with the highest throughput of traffic. What this doesn't show, but around this roundabout you've got Swindon Town Football Stadium, there's a big supermarket, a big shopping centre, and it's kind of very close to one of the industrial centres, so kind of Intel have an office very close to this. So lots of traffic, but lots of traffic gets through there very quickly and very safely because there's so many different routes. So instead of a traffic light, kind of where it's that top down, oh, I know what cars should go where and when, and somebody's making that central decision, you've got the layout of the roundabout, which are enabling constraints. There's some constraints in there, but they enable the traffic to flow around the roundabout in multiple directions, and the people that are on the roundabout doing the driving can make their own decisions and kind of collaborate as well by looking at each other and not driving into each other to come up and get that smooth flow of traffic. So catchball is going through this process. It's you catch, so you kind of take the X matrix and you pass it on to another group. So they catch it, they look at it, they reflect on it, they ask questions about it, and then they improve it. They come up with better alternative ideas, better ideas, new ideas, and then they pass it back or pass it on to another group that they think can have good input, who catch it. So you're constantly going around this process of catch the matrix, catch the strategy deployment plan, reflect on it, improve it, pass it on to somebody else. So it's constantly moving around the organisation, constantly being improved. Everybody has visibility of it, everybody has input into it. So it kind of looks a bit like this. It's the best way of visualising it that I could. You probably start off with a central team, C-level team, senior leadership team, and they'll come up with the idea about what the results are, what the results they think are good results, and maybe what they think some good ideas for strategies are, and maybe some indicators, and they might even suggest some tactics. And then each of these people kind of takes and forms a new team. So they're part of the main team, but they're also part of another team that's going off and saying, well, let's take this and let's look at a specific area about this that we think that needs work. And sometimes they'll then create another X matrix. So they'll take another level of detail X matrix, maybe just focusing on one of the tactics. So reporting. What do we mean by reporting? Well, let's form a team to go off and figure that out and create an X matrix about what do we mean by reporting. How are the indicators, what are the indicators right? Maybe we want to tweak the indicators. Let's just double check on and make sure we understand how reporting fits into the strategy. And what things are we going to do to implement that reporting tactic? So that could be creating dashboards, it could be getting some tooling in, I don't know, what do we want to report? Things like that. So answering some of those questions. And then you might go on another again. So they'll then create some more sub-teams. It's like, okay, we think to get reporting, we need to bring in some standard tooling. Let's create a team to go off and investigate that. So all that goes out. So this is that kind of throwing the X matrix, throwing the strategy around, and each of these teams takes it, reflects on it, improves it. So the communication is round the teams. So there's kind of peer-to-peer communication going on, and you've got up and down, inside out, however one you talk about it, communication going on. So everybody's working together on this, but in a fairly structured way. When I drew this out, I kind of suddenly realised that it kind of looks a little bit like holacracy. So I think that's one of the things that I'm kind of thinking about at the moment is strategy deployment and holacracy. Are they how similar are they? Are they different? I don't know. If anybody got any ideas about that, I'd love to talk about it. So one of the things we do is we're getting nested experiments. So that high-level X matrix, that high-level strategy, our strategy is a hypothesis. We think if we follow this strategy, we're going to get the results. we need to test that strategy by implementing some tactics. So when we go into do. But then we take that, okay, we're going to implement the reporting tactic. Well, how are we going to know, how are we going to test this? Well, we need to run some more experiments. So you get a nested experiment another level down. Okay, reporting, we're going to get a tool in. How do we know whether the tooling, if we've got the right tooling, if toolings work? Oh, well, we need to run some more experiments. So in order to test our really big experiment around strategy, we run some smaller experiments, 12-month, quarterly experiments around some of the tactics. And each of those are running some smaller weekly experiments. And ultimately, you're down to the daily level when you're really into Kaizen and continuous improvement. And it's all aligned. Because we've got the X matrix, and maybe we've got layers of X matrix, we can see how it all ties up. So when you're running one of these small experiments down here, and you're implementing TDD, you understand why are we doing TDD. We're doing TDD because we think it's going to improve, it's part of some kind of quality tactic. We think maybe that's kind of part of reporting. We think TDD is going to give us some good reports on testing and quality. And that's part of our strategy to improve our quality. So we can understand why we're doing it, and if TDD doesn't work for some reason, we can try something else. We're not just doing TDD because we've been told to do it. So this is how I tend to find it fits in. So usually we come in and I'm working as an agile consultant. We're doing an agile rollout, an agile transformation. So usually I kind of start with some kind of X matrix around that and figure out, well, how does this agile thing that we're doing fit into your organizational strategies? Let's make sure we're clear on what are your strategies and what I'm doing going to help with that. How are we going to measure improvements and what results are you trying to get? And then we can start figuring out, so what do I do? What do we do as part of this agile transformation? Do we start working with specific projects? Do we work with specific sites or locations? Do we work with specific customers? So what's our tactical way of implementing agile? That'll usually, actually, we can then roll that up. So catchball doesn't always start at the top. This is an example of that catchball process starting somewhere in the middle and saying, we're doing an agile transformation, this is what we think, this is why we think we're doing it, and we're actually going to throw that up the organization. So they, and actually what they've done, probably without thinking about it, is they've said, usually most organizations effectively decide to do an agile transformation as a tactical thing. So we can now help organizations understand how this agile transformation tactic fits in and correlates to their strategies, or does it? And how are they measuring improvement? And actually, how does that help them to achieve results? So we make a linkage up to the high-level organization around why we're doing an agile transformation. And then we can link it back down. So let's say we say, we're going to start this agile transformation by working with a specific customer. Again, that all maps onto the same strategies, probably the same improvements and the same indicators. And then we can start introducing methods or practices and techniques. And it should all tie together. I have to quote Dave Snowden. It's mandatory. It's in my contract. So he talks a lot about experiments, and I think his ideas around experiments are very, very useful. So we need a portfolio of experiments because we don't know what's going to work and what's not going to work. We need lots of experiments, and sometimes they might need to be contradictory. We might need an experiment that both tries to prove TDD works and both tries to prove TDD doesn't work. How do we do that? Well, we could have a team doing TDD and a team not doing TDD, or maybe we're introducing some kind of reporting, some tooling. Let's actually implement multiple tools because we don't know which one's going to work. And one of those tools might be a very heavyweight bureaucratic one, and one of them might be a really simple one. So different experiments with the different contradictory, and then some of them oblique. So some of them attacking the problem from an unusual angle. If you've got kids, you're probably used to your oblique ways of working. If you try and tell your child what to do, they will do the opposite. But if you do an oblique strategy and tell them to do something different, you end up getting them to do what you want to do. So not attacking the problem head on, by attacking it in a roundabout way, you sometimes get what you want. There's a really good book called Obliquity with some good examples of that. And then taking a naive perspective. By naive, Dave doesn't mean stupid. He means somebody who doesn't have domain expertise. So bringing somebody in from outside the organization or outside your way you're working who doesn't really understand your ways of working and doesn't understand your domain, but has some other skills of their own, they can probably take their skills and their ideas and kind of go, well, in my industry we'd do it this way, and you might kind of go, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. How can we apply that to our situation? So that's a naive way of working. So coming up with a portfolio of varied experiments to figure out which ones are going to work. And then the other contractual obligation is to mention Reinertsen and have a quote from him. So he talks a lot about cadence. This having a regular rhythm. So doing strategy deployment, coming up with an X matrix is not a one-off thing. Build a cadence around it, and a lot of that cadence is around looking at the indicators and reviewing the indicators. And sometimes you look at them and say, you know what, this indicator isn't moving. So maybe the tactics we chose are not the right ones. Let's try doing something different. Or maybe an indicator is getting worse. Or, you know what, this indicator is looking really, really good. Let's amplify. Let's do more of that tactical thing. And building a cadence around that, a regular cadence, and getting into rhythm, starts making this more predictable. So the idea of the regular predictable rhythm turns unpredictable into predictable events. If we know we're going to get together and review metrics on a fortnightly or a monthly or a quarterly basis, we can start building some predictable rhythm around that. And another quote on this, I think I saw this from another running quote, and then I realised that it's even better than that. Does people know who Lupita Nyong'o is? She's in the new Star Wars film. So having a quote for somebody in the new Star Wars film, I thought was quite a unique thing to do. But she's talking about failure here. We need to have organisations that are failure tolerant, because you're going to run experiments and you're going to try practices and techniques, and they're not going to work, and we need to be okay with that. If we don't risk failure, we risk not learning. Well, we don't risk not learning, we don't learn. So in order to learn, in order to improve, in order to figure out what are the right practices, how's Agile going to work for us, we need to try things out and prepare to learning. Because remember, failure is your first attempt in learning. Okay, so strategy deployment, let's kind of just quick review then. So there's this idea of, as an organisation, how do we deploy a strategy? A strategy deployment, it's not planned deployment, it's not tactical deployment. Let's get everybody in the organisation involved. X-Matrix is a nice way of doing that. It's a really simple way of visualising and communicating the strategies, the tactics, the indicators, how it all fits together, and then using catchball to make sure that everybody's involved. It's not a top-down, one-directional thing. It's peer-to-peer. It's up and down the hierarchy. These are the probably two main books if you're interested in it. So Getting the Right Things Done, this one here is a simpler read. Doesn't talk about the X matrix, but talks about strategy deployment at a higher level and more using strategy A3s. This is the book that's really good for getting into the X matrix. It's not an easy read, and it's very kind of manufacturing focused. But if you can get over that and kind of skim through it, and I found it a really good book to work through and kind of think about how do these players and ideas in that book apply to what I do and what we're doing in terms of trying to help our organisations be more agile. I'd recommend just take this. You don't need a printed template. You can just take a piece of paper and do this in pencil. Have a go at it. Think about what, if I was going to do an X matrix for my organisation, what would it look like? What are my organisation's results for the year? What's their strategy? What are we measuring? And what are the tactical things are we doing? And then see how they correlate to each other. And share that with your colleagues and your peers, and have some conversations around how's our agile transformation working. Or maybe if you're about to start an agile transformation, it's a good, just give it a go. It's really simple, low technology. Because I kind of think this is the question that generally we're trying to answer, and this is one of the things that got me into this. I used to go to organisations and you'd start doing some agile stuff with them, and people would kind of go, yeah, but how do we know if this agile stuff's working? And I kind of look at them and I'd kind of go, yeah, it's a good question. How do you know if anything's working? Agile's just a tactic. We're just doing Scrum, or we're doing Kanban, or we're doing SAFe. If it's working, it means the organisation is successful. How do we know if the organisation is successful? That's the question we should be answering. And I kind of come back to that idea that Agile is just a tactic, really. Let's use agility as a strategy. Last quote from Dean Karnazes. Listen to everyone, follow no one. So there's lots of good ideas around there. By saying come up with your own ways of working, I'm not saying reinvent the wheel, throw out everything that you've learned and start from scratch. There's still come to conferences, pick up ideas, but don't just do something because I said so, or Tim said so, or Vasco said so. It's kind of pick on the people that I can see that I can recognise. Don't just do it because somebody says so. Listen to them, think about it. Does it apply to you? Do you think it's going to help you solve some of your problems? Is it going to help your organisation be successful? Is it going to help them implement agility as a strategy? Okay, thank you.